welcome. If you're here for a record retention update, then you're in the right place. My name's Kevin Bowling. I'm court administrator and an attorney referee in Ottawa County, next door to us here in Grand Haven, Holland, Hudsonville area, not too far away. And to try to think about where we're going to be going with this, we have a subtitle of impact of the electronic content management workflow and legal changes on a paperless court environment. But we thought that before we get to the idea of going all paperless, Jeff is going to introduce himself, and then we've got a short video clip just to see if you're all awake after lunch and give you an example of some places where, even though paperless is our goal, our holy grail of sorts, there may be some times when we still want to consider the paper.
Hi, I'm Jeff Barlow, and my bio is in the materials, so I can read it when I need to remind myself who I am. Briefly, my background is I was a lawyer for about 10 years. I got a degree in computer science. I've got an MBA and a certified project manager. I'm multilingual. I speak techie. I speak law. And when the judge said this morning that the tech folks and the judges don't speak the same language, that's correct, but it's not the total story. They actually don't even think the same way. It's like, I think about, well, gee, how can we communicate with aliens? Heck, we can't even communicate with whales. In fact, it's very difficult to communicate with judges sometimes. So I managed to parlay that into a fairly lucrative and incredibly fun career. I'm really passionate about doing that, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm sort of here as Sancho Panza to Kevin, who has been, you probably all know him, and he has been the man in moving Michigan and its laws and rules forward, and it's really a privilege to be here on this. Kevin put together these slides, and the first slide, the first line is paperless court, fact or fiction. And so we have, hopefully, we'll see if we can make this technology work. We're going to try and run this little thing here, and maybe it works.
Watch closely. It's only 40 seconds.
I apologize. It's all in French.
Emma. Huh? Emma. 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 Emma.
So hopefully you get the point.
So the answer is yes, fact, but not a pleasant fact. No. Okay, well, so now, Kevin, you said you were going to drive, but I see that I have to go ahead and push the on key.
I'll let you go ahead and do that.
So the next line here is it the holy grail for court managers? Well, very briefly on that, who knows who Willie Sutton was? You can ask this question. Willie Sutton was a bank robber in the 30s when they had the big, that was, when they really had the great bank robbers. And that's not what he's remembered for. What he's remembered for was that one time he was interviewed and asked why he robbed banks. You can't hear back there? Okay. All right. He was asked why he robbed banks. And his answer was, because that's where they keep the money. Well, guess what? Courts are so document intensive that if you need to save money, you have to look at document management. So, holy grail, I don't know about that, but where the money is, absolutely. Does ECM workflow make paperless environment possible? Well, is John Battles in this thing? Because I'm going to, I told him, I quote him all the time. What he says is that when they went to their electronic content management system, workflow is what made it work and made it save money and provide benefit to them. So I go back far enough to the days of just imaging, and it's not a matter of whether or not it's possible, it's a matter of whether or not it's desirable. it's a real question whether or not it's desirable. You could save things maybe in terms of some storage space, but other than that, without workflow, ECM is hard to, really very difficult to justify, particularly in a court environment. If you were if you were the state archivist, maybe it would be different, but I know that for courts, I just don't see it. Does going paperless require a significant cultural change? Well, the answer to that in a word is, yeah, I think so. This happened to be in the paper the day that Kevin and I got together to discuss this thing. I don't know if you could read it, but the guy's about ready to go ahead and zip line with a file. And the guy in the window says, yeah, it's a data transfer system I can understand. Okay? And I get that. Yes, I think the judge said a lot about the cultural change that's needed this morning, so we are short on time. We won't belabor that too much more here.
Yeah. So when we're looking at the court environment, and just out of curiosity, how many of you are in courts or connected with courts here? Okay, so the majority of you are. I think it's safe to say that we all understand we have this culture that for decades, centuries, has been reliant on paper. The judge talked about it a little bit this morning. We're used to that idea of paper. We have a certain comfort. See, I'm holding paper right here. I probably should have done this on an iPad or something. But there's something about having that feel. It's the same thing where some of us are reading the book, or where, you know, Emma was flipping the pages in bed while he was on his iPad. But we also have a number of different legal requirements for paper. And that's part of when Jeff and I were talking earlier, trying to figure out what some of the takeaways are from today. Part of my selfish reason for wanting to be here and be part of this is that I want to try to gain some support to get some court rule changes, some legislative changes, some standard changes in Michigan that really are going to allow us to do away with some of the legal requirements, at least give us the option even for long-term record retention. But we also realize that there's a low tolerance for change. All of us have seen it. Any of us that have gone through a long-term or IT project or some kind of technology upgrade or something like that, one of the key things in a court manager's toolbox is a box of Kleenex that we keep on the desk for the crying staff members that come in and want to shoot themselves or shoot you and say, please don't make me do this again. You know, we like it. It works the way we have it. We have this low tolerance for change. So, but even with that low tolerance, there have been some recent changes. Some changes that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And those of you that were in the e-filing session this morning with Dan, he touched on a few of these. When we started in Ottawa County with OnBase 7 years ago, there was no legal authorization for electronic signatures. We had to go to the legislature and fight that battle. But we got a bill passed that specifically authorizes electronic signatures, and more recently, as of January of this year, they've been recognized in the court rules as well. So the Supreme Court has taken some leadership in that regard, in addition to the legislature. We've got some pending statutory changes that will go one step further. We've got a House bill that's been submitted by Representative Amanda Price from Ottawa County, and we're developing some momentum with that. We still have to get it through the Senate, get it in front of the governor to sign, but that would change some of that current legal culture. And then these two primary court rules, for those of you living in the court environment, you probably know these and have read them. If you haven't, please take the time when you go back to your court to look at 1.109 and 8.119 and get into the detail there. And you'll see Rhonda's shaking her head. She's seen it. It's there. But finally, the Supreme Court, in rule, has recognized electronic or digital records as part of the official court record. And it talks about electronic signatures being changed as well. And some of the other things that Dan in the e-filing session this morning just basically touched on, if you're not familiar with the Technology Implementation Committee, I think it's something you may want to follow. and see what's going on, or at least have some input from time to time, send suggestions to the committee members. But this is a great example of how the Supreme Court is showing some leadership now. They're getting on the bandwagon with digital records, digital case management systems, and a lot of the standards that are coming out from them are going through this Technology Implementation Committee. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments.
Yeah, and I just want to very briefly say to this that how many folks were in Dan's presentation earlier this morning? Because one of the things that he talked about in this too is that take a moment to think about the fact that there's a whole bunch of different levels that you need to change on these things. There's the statutes, of course, but you already see, and then there's also administrative rules, court rules, orders, and part of the story is that things have been getting sort of out of order. So, no pun intended. So, for example, the Supreme Court has been issuing orders in order to overcome the fact that there are statutory and rule deficiencies, and we're trying to right-size and conform that. And the white paper that came with your materials on legal foundations sort of sets out the way that things, you go through and analyze these things on trying to work out where these disconnects are and get them rationalized through there. Ready for the?
Yep.
Oh, I guess, okay. So my thing here says Jeff to do on this, so I guess that means I talk about this. Okay, the technology's here, the authority is lagging behind. How new is this? Actually, it isn't new at all. And when's it going to end? It's never going to end. It's not new. It's not going to go away. Waiting for legal authority to catch up with new technology as a strategy has approximately the same amount of chance for success as waiting for a teenager to acknowledge that you're right. It just isn't going to happen. Okay, so in order to remain relevant, the courts and the justice system have got to learn to act and react in an environment that is not aligned with the existing legal authorities. This doesn't mean acting willy-nilly or illegally or anything else. It means doing exactly the same kind of things that Kevin and a bunch of other people are doing now, working very hard to stay on top of this and have processes to go about dealing with this in an environment where everything is dynamic. So what you have to do, and this gets practically religious, is you have to figure out what are your core principles. For court systems, there are core principles. We provide fair, impartial decision making. Those things are not negotiable. How you do it, that changes. And the way that you set it up, and I won't get into the white paper thing, but some of it is you want to keep your statutes as flexible as possible, and I see like the statute says per rules promulgated by the Supreme Court. Yeah. That means those are easier to change. That's what makes sense.
Yeah. And one of the, Jeff said he's not going to get into the white paper a little bit, but if you didn't have a chance to look at your binder of materials that we received when you came in, there is a white paper looking at some of these issues that Jeff authored that describes some of these specific details that you might want to look at. But even though the legal requirements may be lagging behind a little bit, it doesn't mean there aren't legal requirements there. And in Michigan, when we're talking about records retention, there's a lot of different things that we have to think about or at least be aware of. So there is an actual Records Reproduction Act. I thought about different ways to describe this, and little bunny rabbits came into my mind at some point thinking about how records seem to be reproducing in incredible ways. But we have that situation going on. We have to deal with technical standards that different Michigan departments put together. We've got the court rules that I mentioned a little bit. How many are very familiar with General Schedule 16? Okay, we've got some hands. For those of you that are uninitiated, this is the kind of document that you have to learn to get used to and love and go to sleep with it under your pillow at night. But General Schedule 16 is a combined schedule. It was combined several years ago, but it's the record retention schedule for court records. So all of the different kinds of court records that exist are laid out there, and it tells us how long we have to keep those. So how many folks are from district courts here? All right, you guys have got it easy. From a long-term record retention standpoint, a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about with digital records don't apply to records that don't have to be kept at least 10 years. In a district court, what's the longest retention period? Okay, that's good. That's an audience participation kind of thing. 6 years is the longest retention period. If you go into circuit and probate court, you have records that are 25 years, 50 years, 80 years, permanent. You know, there are all kinds of things. So we have to be aware of what's in that General Schedule 16, and also be aware that part of the way that the Supreme Court regulates what we do in the courts with records retention is through the court case file management standards. And again, if any of you have insomnia problems, I thought about the possibility of printing this out for all of you, but here are the standards. So, you know, you can read them, you can memorize them, you can get used to them, but the reality is we have a lot of requirements. It's just as Jeff said a minute ago, they're not all consistent requirements. And we're trying to get to the point with what the legislature says and what the Supreme Court says and what the State Court Administrative Office says and what we have for local rules all sort of mesh and become consistent. That's where we need to go. So that's where we're aiming at this point. Part of this is being done through the Technology Implementation Committee. Just out of curiosity, are there any committee members sitting in the room? Oh, okay. I see Denise. All right. So some of you are familiar with this. If I say anything that's not true, just jump up and down and wave your hands and correct me. But I think for a long time, we didn't, from a court management standpoint, we didn't have the kind of leadership we hoped for from the Supreme Court in records management. Maybe it wasn't the thing that rose to the top of their agenda when they've got a lot of other important things to deal about. I think when they formed the Technology Implementation Committee, it showed very clearly that they are trying to provide some leadership in this area. It's organized by the Supreme Court and State Court Administrative Office. There's a broad representation of people. Even with the hands that I just saw here, we've got judge, we've got Court of Appeals, we've got trial court. And recently, ImageSoft has also developed a presence and has been asked to come in and sit at the table and participate in some of these conversations. And it's pretty wide-ranging. The various subcommittees include things like e-filing, document management systems, transmission, courtroom technologies, web-based technologies. And in all of these different areas, there are some standards and court rules that we're working on.
Okay, and I just wanted to make a couple of comments. As you may have, Kevin's got all the specific stuff for Michigan, and I sort of have a broader perspective, less detailed knowledge, but sort of if you look at this and what Michigan is doing, which I will say is exactly the right thing, you look at the National Center for State Courts and what other courts are doing, this kind of structure provides a level of nimbleness that's required to act in this kind of fast-changing environment we're talking about. And taking things from the general principles and working them down to the specifics and putting them in the particular levels. It's very difficult for the legislature to deal with the technical ins and outs. It's difficult even for the Supreme Court, so it gets delegated down. The thing that I'm going to point out, and it's why Kevin's here, he told me last night, it's because this is not a hobby. And it's not, you know, you've got to do this, and it takes time. I mean, and it takes the time of the people who are some of the most valuable resources that you have. You have to commit it to this. There are organized ways to do it. There are ways to do it effectively, but there's no free way to do it.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we've noticed, or that I've noticed with the progress that the Technology Committee has made, is that we've got some successes, but we've got a lot more learning experiences that are going on. It's where we have to sit down at the table and argue about different things, what works in different jurisdictions, and that's why I'm inviting anybody that is interested in learning more about what the committee is doing. If you want to weigh in terms of what works in your jurisdiction, how you want a standard written or something like that, let us know. You know, the recent revisions to 1.109 and 8.119 that went into effect in January came out of a lot of work that the committee did. But there's also a plan. it's not just that a group of us are getting together and just out of curiosity or coming up with topics to work on. If you were to go to the Supreme Court website and in the search bar type in Technology Implementation Committee, it'll take you to a strategic plan that outlines all of the different areas that the committee's working on. So this is where, from my part, putting all of you on notice, this work is going on. If you have an interest, if it's going to affect you, then get involved. We're looking at e-filing rules and standards, guidelines for maintenance and the use and the destruction of electronic records, and this is where it begins to tie back into the whole issue about record retention. And I know that's how we got you in the room by looking at record retention. So we will drill down a little bit farther. It just felt important to give you some of that background. So we've got the case file management standards that I touched on already. We've got the General Schedule 16. We've got this review that's being done by the Technology Implementation Committee. But part of the concerns that are still out there is that we have in those case file management standards some very specific language, and I've heard it used here before, that for long-term record retention, documents have to be able to be produced in a human-readable form. Human-readable. That's the language that comes out of the legislature that deals with this. The difficulty in a digital age now is that human-readable is defined in two ways. So, audience participation time, what are those two ways? What's human readable? Paper and microfilm. That's it, period. So once you get past that magic number of 10 years, if you have to keep any court record longer than 10 years, the current state of the law in Michigan at least seems to me to be that you have to be able to produce that in paper or in microfilm. Those are your options, period. So what do we do about that? How many of you think that's a reasonable option or long-term plan? Okay, not seeing a lot of folks get on that bandwagon. So what we need is to try to get some help approaching the Supreme Court, the State Court Administrative Office, the legislature, to say, get a groundswell around the state of Michigan to say this isn't acceptable anymore. We need to change this, and as Jeff was pointing out earlier, part of what we're trying to do with the legislation that's in place is get to the point where the legislature paints with a broad brush and say, yes, conceptually this is a good idea, but then give the authority to the Supreme Court to make the rules and drill down from there. So that's really where we're trying to go with this, and hopefully at some point getting away from these wonderful file rooms that we've all seen pictures of from time to time. So a concern that has been raised is that for record retention and long-term preservation of records, that imaging has been recognized as being acceptable for active document retrieval systems. And this is in our case file management standards. The problem is it cannot be used for purposes of records retention. This is where, again, it specifies paper or microfilm. I don't know how many of you still have a machine that looks like something like this sitting in your office. I don't know what your experience has been. We've got these. I can't find parts for them anymore. Right. Last time I checked, there was one authorized microfilm repairman in the state of Michigan, and I think he just recently bolted for Florida or Hawaii or someplace. So it creates a problem where we've got old technology that's still being mandated for us.
Now, when Kevin and I went through this, and he showed me this screen, and he was going to just go by, I thought that was a good illustration. I said, there's some very, very important stuff here that isn't necessarily particularly obvious at first glance, but ought to be. And for those of you who are doing what Kevin asks, which is contacting folks and trying to get help on this, I'd point out a couple things on this, like active. What does that mean? Who here knows what Sarbanes-Oxley is? It's really a private sector type thing. Sarbanes-Oxley is the thing the private sector lives and dies by. It's what kind of records you have to keep and what kind of disclosures you have to make. And I'm here to tell you that dead, what I would call dead or static images, microfiche or human readable format, isn't going to do it. In major litigation, if Behemoth Corporation passes off its records in paper, the court says, that can't be searched. You did not comply with the discovery order. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable if it's in that format. Active, let's see, why are we keeping it more than 10 years? Because we may need it someday. So of its own weight, eventually it's got to fall. But, I mean, this is the kind of thing that I think it's tottering on its last legs. It needs a good push. You guys can supply this push by helping Kevin out, and that's my infomercial there for that.
Now, in all fairness to legislators and to Supreme Court justices and some folks at the State Court Administrative Office, you may hear a little passion coming out of our voices, but we realize that some of these changes are difficult and can be difficult. What we wanted to point out with this slide is that we're not the only state dealing with these issues. These same conversations are going on all over the country right now, and we pulled one example from Arizona where they actually hit this question head on and then came up with a detailed rule from the Supreme Court. Their Arizona Code of Judicial Administration is something that's promulgated by the Supreme Court there, and they dealt with this long-term record retention by approving digital records for long-term retention uses. But the concern that has always been raised, the kind of pushback that we get from legislators or sometimes from judges, is that what happens if the technology goes bad? What happens if you start out with one piece of technology and in 3 years it changes, or in 5 years it changes, or in 10 years it changes? We're screwed. Then we can't access those records. What Arizona did with their rules was to say, okay, you can use digital records, but you have to have a plan in place to manage it. And part of that management says that you've got to do environmental scans of what's happening in the technology world. And if something is becoming obsolete, you've got to have a plan in place to migrate those records from one system to another. So there's an expectation that you're going to use some kind of open architecture. It's not going to be a proprietary system that if a company goes bankrupt or changes their business plan or something, you can't access your records anymore. As Jeff and I talked about this a little bit, we thought this particular rule might have gone a little bit too far in terms of going down to the
techie level.
The technical level. But
let me comment a little bit on that. It does get fairly technical, but look where it lives. It doesn't live in the statute. The statute gives the authority and the responsibility for dealing with this. Now, as Kevin says, there are other states. The National Center, there are national standards for doing this, and it's more than a suggestion. When you do this, it's more than a suggestion. There's like a requirement that at 5 years you have to have technology recognized certification agencies saying this technology is good for a period, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and you have to re-examine it every 5 years, like within 25% of the given life cycle of it. It's, as I said before, it's not free. There is no free way to deal with this. Dealing, as was pointed out, dealing with the microfiche is not free. So you have to, the principles that can't be compromised are you've got to be able to keep the records. I mean, like, duh. That's what we're trying to do. How do you do that? Well, today you may do it with RAID 5. Tomorrow, who knows? But somebody, there are lots of technology certification agencies, and what the Arizona law did, and what the national centers got some very good templates that you can use, or your state can use, or it goes all the way down to the local rulemaking area where you say this is how you do it, so nobody forgets. Oh, you know what? We forgot to check and see whether or not this would last another 5 years. Right. No, you have a requirement for a buy-off every 5 years. It has to be bought off, certified, bam, bam, bam.
So you can see where some of this is going. In particular standards, Dan Marnick, when we were talking about e-filing this morning, touched on one set, But those of you that have not looked at it, my hunch is all the technology people in the room are very familiar with the NEAM standards. But that's one that is being used in a lot of courts. It's a National Information Exchange Model. But I think a lot of vendors that service courts and justice-related agencies have figured out that we have this problem. They figured it out long before we came to the table. And they have worked with government organizations to try to develop these kinds of standards that allow us to easily transfer data from one system to another. So some of that work has already been done for us. We don't have to start from scratch, but what we do have to do is step up to the table and figure out how we're going to move forward.
Okay, this is another one that's got Jeff on the top of the page, so I guess I'll talk about this. Okay, even though you're on the right track, you'll get run over. You sit there, Will Rogers. Kevin says he used to be able to make that train go back and forth, but hard to believe. I mean, actual motion in that PowerPoint, Bill Gates wrote a book in 1996. Anybody remember it, The Road Ahead? 1996, ages ago, all that. And there's the guy who's, okay, we know, pretty visionary. Not once in that book did he mention the internet, okay? So now it's not as if nobody's moved forward with that, but basically it comes down to this. All of us, some of us kicking and screaming, have got to go ahead and move on into the future. Our business partners are absolutely demanding it. The public around us is demanding it. The technology that we're using is becoming unsupportable without doing it. So, it's, and the judge today kept alluding to it. I think one of the most powerful things is the kids. Holy cow, it's absolutely scary. The kids who are growing up, I mean, forget about the kids who just grew up with the internet. Kids who are being born today are never going to know a time when they weren't hooked up to have instant, in their skulls, access to the whereabouts of everybody at any time, where they were at every time, all the information. Imagine the teachers who are if there are still classes, talking to a classroom of kids who are communicating in ways that the teachers can't even detect that they're doing it, other than the fact that they may have a semi-glazed look behind their Google Glass. So basically, although inaction is an option, that isn't going to stop the change. It's just going to make it more painful. Yeah.
So part of what we wanted to do, and if we've got time, we may ask for some suggestions from you, but just to imagine some of the possibilities. Where could we go if some of these changes that we were talking about might be made? Again, we got you to come in here thinking about records retention. As you can see, the record retention issue is part of a bigger puzzle. We have to deal with all of these different court records. One of the fundamental purposes of courts in our society today is to maintain and monitor the legal status of different things. We do that through different judgments, orders, records, whether it's somebody's marital status or their business status or their adoptive status or whatever. We have to be able to maintain these records and maintain them so that we can find them when we need them. Even though there may be a world down the road that Jeff's describing where we
don't want to hear it.
where we won't need any of these. But right now, some of the things that we're trying to move the state of Michigan toward are some statutory changes that specifically authorize digital retention. We don't need the legislature to get into the weeds and dictate how it's going to be done. But if we can get them to provide some broad authorization, the same way they've provided broad authorization for electronic signatures and those types of things, if we can move them toward that direction with digital record retention, it'll be a move forward. And then we're going to have to work with the Supreme Court and the State Court Administrative Office, and this is where all of you that are in courts come into play, in terms of looking at our record retention standards. What are those standards going to look like? Going back to Jeff's earlier comment, how long do we really need to keep these records? What are we going to use them for? Do we want to keep them just because it's a good security blanket and we like to be able to hang on to them, or are we actually going to use them for some purpose, and identifying what that is, and then looking at those standards of how we're going to keep them. How can we manage that electronically, and maybe begin to actually imagine the possibility of a paperless court or a paper-on-demand court, where we have the ability to go in. If we need to produce a record, we can, but we don't have to maintain all of that paper. And obviously, this is going to require some kind of guidelines for e-records, whatever those look like.
Right. And I just want to limit myself to two things. The first thing is and there's more. There's lots of really great full presentation level things on imagining the new possibilities, and so there will be those. You will hear those. We give some of those. They're great. They're a lot of fun. We don't have time for them today. The second thing is that I had written down here. Sarbanes-Oxley and the things that are coming along with that caused me to say records retention is an anachronistic term. You've got it, you're having to deal with it now, but really within the next couple of years we're going to get to the point where there's not going to be any talk about ever getting rid of any records. Every corporation that is dealing with trying to think of when they can get rid of records, even if it's a note saying, do you want to go out for lunch, is finding out that the answer is, no, you have to keep it. I mean, you used to have the argument, well, it's very expensive to keep it. It's expensive to manage it, but you have to manage it anyway. So that's sort of my futures thing on this. But right now, you've got to move yourself to the point where it's costing you a lot of money to deal with the requirements that you've got now, and Kevin needs help in getting past that.
Well, in the cost, I'm smiling to myself. I'm looking at our county clerk in the back. Dan, wave your hand, Dan. Dan and I have this conversation periodically, but we actually have a lot of court records in mines and underground storage and things like that, not just on site, because we've grown out of the space that's available. From the nods in the room, I'm assuming several of you are doing the same thing. Every time we talk about creating another piece of paper and having to put it in a file and having to store it and having staff time to retrieve it, in the back of my mind, I'm hearing a cash register go ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. There's costs associated with all of that, and while there's still costs associated with digital creation of records and retention, what we're trying to do is get to the point where we can balance those out or cut down on our existing costs and create additional efficiencies. And at least for some of us that have worked with the ImageSoft products and the OnBase software, that's part of the way we've begun to achieve that, and we can show some of those savings.
Yeah, and my only thing on this is you got to pay for both. You got to pay for maintaining the stuff in paper or microfiche or whatever. You've got to pay for it electronically. It just turns out that electronically is cheaper, safer, easier to use, and makes a whole lot more sense. But other than that, why do it?
So you want to hit the next one? So we've got some new possibilities that are out there in front of us. This is what the Technology Implementation Committee is about. It's part of what we're trying to work with. It's, I think, part of the reason why ImageSoft, as a recognized leader in this area, has been brought into that table as well. And we're trying to get others actively engaged in that process. We're looking for suggestions. We're looking for constructive criticism, for participation. We have a good group, let me see those hands again, that are on the Technology Committee. So look around, keep those hands up for a minute. Everybody look around, get those faces. These are at least folks that you can go and talk to and share ideas about what can we do to create a better environment for the electronic management of court records, including that long-term record retention process. Judge?
I'm on the committee for that record retention, and we spent the last meeting 2 months ago, and they canceled the meeting for tomorrow because they're so happy with the way it is right now. We talked about the fact that why we had record retention policies because paper was so hard then we got into things, well, we can't really give direction until we know which way the court's going to go and the state's going to go with technology and demands. How do we make them make a decision as to what they want to do in the long run and order everyone in the state to do it rather than have 83, again, different vendors providing different material and different standards?
I think everybody sitting in this room has a part of that answer. And I don't know that it's going to change. I think we all realize, those of us that work with courts, work with those judges that were described in the keynote this morning, that you've got busy dockets. You've got other things that are on your mind. You know, when I first talked, Bev, I don't know if it was you and I that talked about this or not, I thought about record retention as a title for this session, and I thought, who the hell is going to come to that? You know, that's worse than watching paint dry. It is boring stuff. So trying to figure out how do you take something boring like records retention and say to the Supreme Court or to the legislature, this is important stuff and it needs to rise to a higher level on the agenda. Maybe it won't get all the way to the top ever, but if we can move it up a little bit by letting them hear our collective voices, that we need that leadership, we need some direction, we need new standards, we need to be able to move as technology is moving forward, and that's going to make it better for everybody. So we need to talk about how do we craft that message. Do we put it in terms of ROI and say, okay, if we can affect your wallet somehow, that's going to be a good thing. Do we put it in terms of being able to provide better public service? Well, maybe there are constituencies out there that are voting for judges and justices that maybe that'll help get their attention. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I'm looking for ideas, and I'm willing to get on that train to kind of push this forward.
I have one that if you just sort of look at the broader picture, not just in Michigan but everywhere where change like that occurs, there are a lot of really good reasons, but the one that causes people to move is money. And so I would say it like this. If you had an oil tank and it's leaking, well, let's see. You don't have to do anything. Let's wait till next week. Guess what happens during the next week? You lose more oil. Every day that goes by that they don't take action on that is costing them money. That's sort of my approach.
Maybe maybe that's part of it.
But the thing we talked about at these conferences and meetings is that the most logical thing would be the state to set up the storage for all the courts and to have them do the e-filing and have them do the management of it and send it out to us courts individually. That's the most cost savings. They won't even look at that. So where do we go with an idea as to what's... If we're talking about saving money where the best idea is not even going to be considered.
You know what? You can't. Maybe you don't go to the best idea then really on the first step. I said this morning, when they talk about project management, how to successfully manage a project. Number one, pick a customer who's been burned really bad once, because you know what? Then they learn. I mean, sometimes you don't learn everything in one step. Yeah. You have to take what you can get.
I think what you're asking also ties in nicely to what we tried to do at the beginning of this very short session, and at the end of it is to provide some perspective. So we gave you a little perspective that we may not want to go entirely paperless with our little French experiment, and there are some times when you still want the paper. Okay. And Jeff's had some comments about this as providing some perspective at the tail end.
Well, and I'll just keep it very close, which is that my response when I saw this was I responded with H.L. Mencken's "Those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it," and my version of that is "Those who remember the past," which is the old guys here. Those who remember the past are old. So you get some of this war story stuff, but really, when we first installed in Oregon our system, the biggest problems, and we had these kinds of debates where, the buildings, you can't wire the buildings because they're historical buildings. Now, who remembers those arguments today? But those were showstoppers back in the day. The terminals are so big that the clerks have no desk space left. Abandon the project. So
we just have to keep working at this, and we appreciate you taking the time to at least humor us and come in and participate in the discussion. But I'm just curious, are there any questions or thoughts or comments from any of you before we have to wrap up here? Lots of thoughts. If we needed some help calling legislators or calling the Supreme Court, can I see any hands? Would anyone after this conversation be willing to help out and join in the fray? Okay, well, we got a few here. That's good.
Can we get blood samples from
Everyone helps. So watch what's going on. Keep an eye on the Supreme Court website. Check out the Technology Implementation Committee. See what's going on. If you've got thoughts or ideas you want to share, you saw the people that raised the hands that serve on the committee. Let me know, let Jeff know, and we'll try to carry those ideas and thoughts forward. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sir?
Very nicely done.